This presentation is given in celebration of the 100th anniversary publication, A Century of Collecting, American and European Paintings, Prints, and Sculpture at the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art. I am Kristen Miller Zohn, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions, and I will speak about the history of the museum's collection and will concentrate on the efforts that collectors, staff, and outside experts have made to add to and care for the art collection. I will also be showing some interesting correspondence and other documents from our files, which we were not able to include in the book. In 1922, the Eastman Memorial Foundation was founded to honor the memory of Lauren Rogers, who had died tragically in 1921 at the age of 23. The foundation was to, quote, promote the public welfare by founding, endowing, and having maintained a public library, museum, art gallery, and education institution within the state of Mississippi, end quote. And the institution established to meet those goals was named the Lauren Rogers Library and Museum. In reading through 100 years of trustee reports and correspondence, I found that there was always a differentiation between the library and museum programs, and that the practice of collecting and exhibiting works of art was always of equal importance to the collecting and circulating of books. The North Wing was constructed as an art gallery in which to hang paintings from the private collection of Lauren's grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Lauren Chase Eastman. Some of these works would enter the collection in the years to come. The building had the best safety precautions available at the time, and this set a precedent of keeping up to date with museum building technology. Hollow tile and brick exteriors, a slate roof, and concrete floors ensured that it was as fireproof as possible for the time. The art gallery boasted special lighting with the latest method of reflected rays from powerful lights through a flat glass ceiling. One early observer remarked that it was significant that a structure conforming to the most modern requirements could be erected on the foundation laid for Lauren's home. Quote, "There's nothing institutional about the building, nothing of the coldly classical," end quote. Compare it, for instance, to the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which was also founded in 1923, or the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, which was founded the next year. They were designed in the Beaux-Arts fashion, which combined motifs from ancient Greece and Rome, the Renaissance, and the Baroque era to create a grand and imposing architectural statement. The Lauren Rogers Library and Museum instead was designed in the colonial revival style, which also uses the classical motifs of columns and arches, but in a simplified way that evokes the federal and Georgian architecture of America's founding period, as opposed to ancient Greece and Rome. The domestically scaled exterior, along with interiors decorated with cork floors and oak wainscoting, create a mood of warmth and hospitality that continues to this day. The interior seems to have been influenced by the family's own homes. Notice the great similarity between the gallery on the left and a room in the home of Lauren's aunt and Uncle Gardner in Iowa, shown on the right. The collections of the museum were shaped from the very beginning by Ella Bradley, who began her work before the library and museum was opened to the public. Although trained in library science and signing all correspondence as librarian, Bradley was to become a very capable art museum professional as well. Her first report to the Foundation's Board of Trustees in March of 1924 stated that 734 art objects had been given to the institution during its first year. Lauren Chase Eastman gave 4 oil paintings and 5 watercolors of scenes of the American West by Henry Rashin and Herman Wendelberg Hansen, whose work you see here. Lauren's mother, Nina Eastman Rogers, donated 7 color etchings by the French artist Camille Foncé. Lauren's father, Wallace B. Rogers, gave 14 European and American works, and one was considered by future museum librarian Nell Davis to be our first acquisition. This was Jose Weiss's Evening. In a 1971 letter to the artist's son, Gerard J. Weiss, she says that it was purchased in 1923 by Lauren Rogers' father for the museum. Other donations include French artist Rosa Bonheur's charcoal drawing, Deer. This, along with the Rashin and Hansen works donated by Eastman, had been purchased in 1923, apparently with the institution in mind. In our files, we have a copy of the receipt from a London gallery for the Bonheur, which was purchased for £35. What is notable about these early acquisitions is that many were produced by living artists, and so are the contemporary art of their time. This point is made by the fact that the Scottish Laird of Finzian and artist Joseph Farquharson corresponded with Rogers in a letter you see here, expressing pleasure that his Scotch furs should find a home in America. In addition to the works already mentioned, Rogers gave 8 antique tablets from Babylonia, a sampler, and 26 medals and war decorations, and Eastman gave 3 medals. P.W. McClintock, the only non-family member to donate during the museum's first year, gave 178 Chinese and other silver and copper coins. Acquiring this type of miscellany is common for museums. Other types of things purchased and donated throughout our history include Asian decorative arts such as Chinese snuff bottles and Japanese ceramics, stained glass, a suit of armor, and Cypriot pottery. However, to a greater extent, the collection began with the types of objects that have continued to be acquired for 100 years. European and American works, many of which were contemporary at the time they were collected. The most significant gift of 1923 was from Lauren's great-aunt by marriage, Catherine Marshall Gardner, who donated 485 baskets and specimens of beadwork. She had begun to assemble this collection in the early years of the century after reading a newspaper article about the decline in the production of Native American baskets and other crafts. Her initial plan was to collect contemporary Native American baskets, but, quote, the lure of old and fine work specimens soon gained the ascendancy, end quote, and she made purchases by building up a network of friends and dealers across the country. She also traveled abroad to acquire baskets from all over the world. Gardner's impressive collection needed a better display setting than her home, and as plans for an institution to honor Lauren came together, Gardner pledged her collection to the museum. The first object to be entered on the museum's books as an acquisition was a Northern Athapascan tray basket. It was clear soon after the opening of the Lauren Rogers Library and Museum that more space was needed to display and house ongoing donations from Gardner's basket collection and additional gifts from other family members and friends. A 2-level addition was built, the lower level to be the home of Laurel Library Association, a circulating library. On the main level behind the original building was the Long Gallery, the largest space, along with 5 other galleries, all of which allowed the display of baskets, other Native American objects, American and European paintings, and Asian decorative arts, as well as temporary exhibitions. Just as Gardner had begun to collect baskets long before there were thoughts of establishing a museum in Lauren's honor, between 1907 and 1911, Lauren Chase Eastman had been assembling an excellent group of European and American paintings. As he bought them for the family home in Iowa, they tend to be small, and they complement the domestic scale of the museum very well. James William Pattison of the Art Institute of Chicago wrote an article for the Fine Arts Journal about a 1911 exhibition of contemporary French and Dutch art at the Chicago dealer Moulton and Ricketts, in which several of the paintings purchased by Eastman that year were included. On the bottom left, you see our Breton, on the top right, our Corot, and on the top left, our Millet, the stunning first steps, all of which illustrate Eastman's great ability to choose fine pictures. Pattison wrote of first steps, quote, it has many times occurred to me that when this artist made a charcoal drawing on white paper and tinted it with colored chalks, he did the best work that ever came from his hands. There is such coolness and restfulness that the tired may find rest in them, end quote. He goes on to say that the work would, quote, add value to any collection, however important, end quote. In admiring the work, Pattison and Eastman were in good company. A reproduction of the drawing was the basis for an 1890 oil painting, First Steps After Millet, by Vincent van Gogh. The drawing and oil were featured side by side in the important Millet van Gogh exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris in 1998. Works by artists of the Hudson River School were popular with collectors of the early years of the 20th century, and they comprise more than half of the paintings in Eastman's collection, including Thomas Moran's A Glimpse of Long Island Sound from Montauk. It was purchased from Moulton and Ricketts, who asked the artist to write Eastman a few words in regards to this painting. He said, quote, I gladly do so because I think it among the best of my works, trusting that it will continue to hold your interest and admiration as strongly as when you acquired it, end quote. Other important American artists whose works came to the museum from Eastman's collection include Winslow Homer, whose Fisherman's Wife might have been a study for a larger work now in the collection of the Yale University Art Gallery, The Morning Bell. Eastman died in early 1924, and in 1926 and 27, his wife donated a few of these paintings to the museum. A great many more entered the collection in 1934 as gifts from his daughter, Nina Eastman Rogers. Although librarian Ella Bradley was the official staff person, Wallace B. Rogers really acted as the curator and actively acquired works for the museum. Several European and American paintings were purchased from the Chicago dealer M. O'Brien and Son, which is the dealer from which Millet's First Steps was purchased after its exhibition at Moulton and Ricketts. These included November Sunset by John Francis Murphy. During its acquisition, the dealer sent a photograph of the landscape with a note on the back from Elliot Dangerfield, himself a well-regarded artist who had written about Murphy in 1917 and was qualified to authenticate it. He said, quote, "I have examined this painting, and in my opinion, it is genuine. It is a most artistic work of J. Francis Murphy. I'd like to own it myself," end quote. A pastel by master artist James Abbott McNeill Whistler was purchased in 1927 from John Levy Galleries in New York. The gallery sent a note a few months later from connoisseur and art dealer Percy Moore Turner, who said it was, quote, "a fine and characteristic example of the art of the artist in this medium. It is signed with his characteristic butterfly sign and belongs, in my opinion, to the Amsterdam period of the master," end quote. While Turner's assessment of the high quality of the work is still agreed upon by scholars, his opinion on the setting of the harbor view has proven to be incorrect. In 1983, Whistler scholar Margaret MacDonald of the University of Glasgow was conducting research on his works in the United States and visited the museum to see the pastel. In her opinion, the type of paper used and the particular butterfly signature on the piece identifies the work as a view of the Giudecca in Venice, produced in 1879 or 1880. The work is now titled Nocturne in Venice Harbor, the Little Rivulet in Opal, and is included in the artist's catalog raisonné. It is very interesting to note that Rogers chose to acquire this pastel while he was in the middle of putting together one of the museum's major and important collections, Japanese ukiyo-e prints. The term ukiyo-e means images of the floating world, a reference to the theater and entertainment districts of urban Japan in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most popular subjects were those of leisure and pleasure, and later artists would adapt the ukiyo-e style that had been honed on these subjects to the depiction of landscapes. In 1924, Rogers' friends Dr. and Mrs. Joseph Hume of New Orleans introduced him to the Chicago ukiyo-e print dealer Frederick Gookin, who served as a consultant and conservator. With advice from Gookin, Rogers acquired a total of 142 prints for the museum in the mid to late 1920s. Librarian Ella Bradley traveled to Chicago to meet Gookin at the beginning of the consultant's work with the museum. On the left, you see a letter from Gookin to Bradley. She was to have a large role in the collection's formation, as they corresponded about storing, framing, cataloging, and exhibiting the prints. She even purchased and donated the beautiful print you see on the right to the museum in 1928. Other acquisitions of the 1920s included a striking floor lamp, which entered the collection in 1928. It is a fine example of the work of Philadelphia master blacksmith Samuel Yellen, whose hand-wrought iron gates, railings, and hardware can be found throughout the building. Yellen was commissioned to provide ironwork for hundreds of buildings across the United States, including the New York Stock Exchange and the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And we are so fortunate to have his work here, including the only known water fountain that he ever designed. According to Bradley in her annual report, the most important and popular purchase of the last year of the 1920s was a suit of English armor from the 17th century. For many years, the armor has been on display in what was the original art gallery, now known as the Reading Room, and it is still a source of fascination for our visitors, especially children. Under Bradley's direction, donations remained steady in the 1930s and 40s, although purchases were fewer, perhaps due to the economic effects of the Depression and World War II. The most significant acquisition of this period came in 1934 from the Lauren Chase Eastman collection by his daughter Nina Eastman Rogers, with a donation of 19 oils and 1 watercolor, as described earlier. Catherine Marshall Gardner passed away in 1935, having given her unwavering support and some 900 objects to the museum. In 1936, the museum received the donation of Girl with Bull by the American artist Charles Hawthorne from Mr. and Mrs. Charles H. Worcester, who were important patrons of the Art Institute of Chicago. Mr. Worcester was a paper and lumber company investor, and he and Rogers must have bonded through their mutual business and cultural interests. After the Hawthorne arrived, Rogers wrote to Mr. and Mrs. Worcester, quote, "I don't believe you can realize, both of you, what a thrill we had when your Hawthorne was received, unpacked, and hung. Of course, you know we have nothing like it in the gallery, and it certainly does add a wonderful amount to the quality of the whole collection. It was especially pleasing to have it this time because we haven't been able to spend money for new things during the last 5 or 6 years. It means a lot, though, for people here to feel that the little collection here has the interest and assistance of 2 people who have done so much and are doing so much now for art." end quote. A noteworthy acquisition of European art was made in 1947, Rembrandt's etching Virgin and Child with Cat and St. Joseph at the Window, which was the gift of Clara Baldwin. That same year, Ella Bradley passed away, and Nell Davis, who had been working at the institution as an assistant librarian, was appointed head librarian and acting curator. In the late 1940s, the board sought the expertise of Herman Warner Williams, Jr., director of the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. As the first art museum professional to assess a program that was overseen by librarians and amateur collectors, Williams gave some much-needed advice. He pointed out the necessity of formulating a general policy for purchasing works, and he made recommendations to concentrate on artistic quality in acquisitions and exhibitions, to add strength to strength by collecting mid-19th century American works, to question bargains and investigate potential purchases through impartial authorities, and to return loans within a year. He was a man of his time, and some of his suggestions have not aged well, such as creating the desired friendly, informal atmosphere by permitting smoking in at least one gallery. I don't know if the trustees followed that advice, but they did agree to deaccession several works that he had deemed surplus paintings and to repaint and reinstall the permanent collection galleries by, quote, regrouping of exhibits into American, European, current, primitive culture, and Oriental galleries, end quote. Due to his assessment that the American art collection was the strongest, it was placed conspicuously in the Long Gallery, a practice that is still followed to this day. After the death of Nina Eastman Rogers in 1950, a group of 22 ukiyo-e prints were given to the museum from the personal collection of her husband, Wallace B. Rogers, who had passed away in 1943 after years of tireless service to the institution. A new art committee of the Board of Trustees vetted those acquisitions, as well as pieces of English and miniature silver, a watercolor by Raoul M. de Longpre Jr., and 3 miniature portraits of family members, including one of Lauren Chase Eastman. A masterpiece was almost lost to the collection in the early 1960s. Jane Rogers Hinson had acquired a landscape by John Singer Sargent from her grandmother, Catherine Marshall Gardner, after her death, and it was loaned to the museum for display. She had spoken with Knoedler Galleries in New York, from whom it had been purchased by the Gardners, about selling it. However, she became ill in 1963, and her husband, longtime foundation president Robert C. Hinson, told Knoedler that she had fortunately decided to, quote, make the picture's temporary home here at the museum a permanent one, end quote. The work is particularly interesting because it depicts Le Chien, the estate of Monsieur and Madame Pierre Gautreau. The latter is better known as the model for Sargent's infamous portrait, Madame X. Another instance of Gardner's relationship with Knoedler Galleries is shown in the history of her portrait that was painted in 1908 by American-born, London-based James Jabusa Shannon. The portrait was shown to acclaim at Knoedler in 1910 and was written up in the International Studio and the New York Times. In the latter, the subject is described as, quote, a woman of middle years. The fresh coloring of the face is relieved against a crown of white hair. The attitude is erect. A bunch of deep blue flowers in the waist of the white gown and a bracelet with stones of Egyptian blue on the wrist provide strong accents of color, end quote. Her granddaughter, Catherine Rogers Exnicius, had retained possession of the work until she passed away in 1973, even though she had promised it to the museum in 1965. Also in 1965, William Brainerd Turner exhibited works from his collection, from which Frank Tenney Johnson's lowered bars, among others, were donated to the museum. He generously bequeathed $100,000, which came to the museum in 1971 after his death. Turner's gift was the second largest ever given to the institution, the first being the initial gift of the Eastmans. In 1968, the newly named Acquisitions Committee again asked for the help of Herman Warner Williams, Jr., who had retired from the Corcoran. With acquisitions in mind, he viewed an exhibition of American paintings at Herschel and Adler Galleries in New York, where he saw John Sloane's Dahlia by the Kitchen Door. The piece was described as a prize and was acquired. Herschel and Adler specializes in fine American and European paintings, and the gallery asked for a list of works in the collection in order to make suggestions to fill in some voids. It is standard practice for museums to share their collections needs with reputable galleries for this purpose, and the museum would make other important purchases from that gallery, such as paintings by Fairfield Porter and James Peale. In the early 1970s, the museum once again retained the services of Herman Warner Williams, Jr., who by this point had almost a quarter-century relationship with the institution. One of the most important acquisitions of this time was Mary Cassatt's Woman Bathing, which you see here on the right. The museum had been in pursuit of a Cassatt since at least 1962, when a portrait had been considered, but was ultimately rejected because the museum was facing expensive electrical work. In 1967, the museum looked at 2 oils and a dry point, but these were not acquired. The next year, the museum finally purchased a Cassatt print, Denise holding her child, seen on the left, one of the artist's many images of interactions between women and children. The 1972 acquisition of Woman Bathing is a more significant one for several reasons. The dry point and aquatint technique she employed is incredibly complex, and the work is one of a group of 10 color prints that she showed at her first independent exhibition in Paris in 1891. Also, the work has a connection to the museum's ukiyo-e collection, as the prints in her series were inspired by the depiction of intimate, commonplace activities in the Japanese works in her own collection. Another work by a first-rank artist was acquired in 1972 when the museum hosted an exhibition of contemporary still lifes circulated by the American Federation of the Arts, from which the museum was given a choice of several paintings to be donated to the collection. Nell Davis wrote to the artist Ramir Bearden to tell him that his still life was, quote, our first choice, and we were very happy to receive it, end quote. She asked him where more information could be found about his work, and he directed her, in a handwritten letter, to a catalog produced by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which had held a retrospective exhibition of his work the year before. Bearden's collage was the first work by a noted African-American artist to enter the museum collection, and this area was to become an important focus of acquisitions in the years to come. The largest contribution to the collection in the early 1970s was English silver of the Georgian period, given by Thomas M. and Harriet S. Gibbons. From the mid-1920s through 1959, Thomas was the publisher and Harriet the editor of the newspaper The Laurel Leader Call, and she served as a museum trustee and chair of the acquisitions committee. In 1971, items from the Gibbons' impressive collection were put on view in the European room at the museum, and objects began to enter the collection. They were eventually to donate about 100 pieces of silver, as well as furniture, ceramics, and paintings. The last objects were given in the early 1980s after Harriet's death. Theirs is the only one of the museum's major collections to be given by a non-founding family member. Here you see examples of this fine collection. The Gibbonses searched for years for a piece by Paul de Lamery, a foremost silversmith of the 18th century. During one of their unsuccessful hunts, they found instead this impressive tea kettle, stand, and lamp by Benjamin Godfrey. They were eventually able to purchase 2 dishes that were part of a large dinner service commissioned from de Lamery by Lord Anson, a naval hero. The 50th anniversary year of 1973 was an important one in our history, as we were granted accreditation by the American Association of Museums, or AAM, now the American Alliance of Museums. This proved that the organization was meeting its stated mission and the field standards and best practices. Some important additions to the collection were made in the mid-1970s, including Robert Henry's The Brown Wrap, a gorgeous portrait of the artist's wife, Marjorie. She is engulfed in luxurious fur and set against such a dark, rich background that it is hard to light well. When Dorothy Tenenbaum of Hammer Galleries sent the piece to Laurel, she said, quote, I am enclosing an overhead light which I feel should be connected to the painting when you present it to the museum committee, end quote. In 1975, Amarita Gordon was named as registrar. She had been hired in 1952 as assistant to the director and left the staff for some years to teach school. In 1977, she was appointed assistant director, and Betty Malloy was appointed head librarian. The end of that year brought the retirement of Nell Davis after over 30 years of leadership within the institution. She would serve as director emeritus until her death in 1999. With plans for the Laurel Library Association to move into its own building in 1978, the space on the lower level underneath the museum rooms became available. A building expansion, designed by Michael Foyle, was completed in 1983 and provided 3,800 square feet of additional space. The downstairs galleries, which had been the public library space, were linked to the main floor by a black marble staircase that was surrounded by gallery space. In 1983, Estill Curtis Pennington, known as Buck, had become the new director, and the name of the institution was changed to Lauren Rogers Museum of Art to reflect a greater emphasis placed on the art collection. Under Pennington's directorship through 1987, the museum made significant gains in its holdings and put the new spaces to good use. The first purchase of the year was an important painting by James Henry Wright. This work, which shows 3 children sitting under a tree and accompanied by their faithful dog, unites the portrait, landscape, and genre themes found in the American collection. This was purchased from Berry Hill Galleries in New York, who donated another work by the artist, Floral Still Life. Other major acquisitions by purchase and donation that year were European and American works, including Knitting Reveries by Louis-Édouard Duboeuf and The Message by Joseph Carreau. The next year was also an important one for 19th and 20th century acquisitions. Buck recommended that the new gallery space surrounding the stairs be installed with 20th century American art, which would free up some space in the long gallery for new acquisitions of late 19th century genre painting. This was fulfilled with the purchase of William Henry Baker's Home Regatta and Francis Coates Jones' Admiring the Child. Although Buck stated that the museum should not focus on collecting contemporary art, a monumental work by John Winslow, Painting in Marcella's Studio, was purchased, and the collection's first photographs, 2 by Mississippian Bernie Imes, were given by the artist. Acquisitions in 1985 were led by the purchase, funded by the museum's annual membership drive and gala, of a pair of portraits by the American artist Benjamin West. While serving as the president of the Royal Academy in London, West had supported and encouraged his countrymen who were studying there. Buck stated that they were, quote, the perfect foundation for all the American paintings in our collection due to his great influence on American art during the first 50 years of the 19th century, end quote. Although the male portrait is labeled with the first initial J, last name Fall, the museum later learned from an historian in Dunbar, Scotland, where the Fall family lived, that the sitter is in fact Robert Fall. His wife Magdalene White is featured in the pendant portrait. Buck announced that he would step down as director, and in late 1987, Marianne Pennington, no relation to her predecessor, came on board as the new director. Her tenure would be filled with the survey and assessment of the museum collections. Collecting philosophies were set in place, and the name of the Acquisitions Committee was changed to the Collections Committee. She determined that American fine arts from 1880 to 1912 were to be the top priority, and that art from the 1930s to the 1950s was in need of enhancement, as was the Native American basket and Georgian silver collections. She agreed with her predecessor that contemporary art not be collected, quote, due to the high risk factor and expense, end quote. Pennington assembled a thematic acquisitions list of American art, and some notable examples from that list did eventually enter the collection, although they were to come many years in the future. John Frederick Peto was among the artists listed to represent American romantic and still life works. His Concord Grapes was acquired in 2009. Members of the 10, a group of American Impressionist painters, included William Merritt Chase, whose Shinnecock Hills was purchased in 2004. And J. Alden Weir, whose Composition in Green was purchased in 2021. Members of the 8, a group of American Revel artists of the early 20th century, were suggested in Pennington's plan. Ernest Lawson's Spring Landscape, Harlem River and House was acquired in 1992, and Everett Shin's Clown on Empty Seats entered the collection in 2017. Collections leadership was solidified in the early 1990s when George Bassey was named director in June 1994, and Tommy Rogers became registrar and curator of exhibits. The tenures of both have lasted into the museum's 100th year. In 1996, Michael DeMarche, who was a member of the art history faculty of the University of Southern Mississippi, was hired as a part-time curator of collections. For the museum's 75th anniversary in 1998, he wrote The French Legacy, the American and European collections of the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art, which accompanied an excellent exhibition of the same name. Although the museum had only periodically pursued purchases of European work since the early years of its history, donations were always welcome. And in 1998, the museum was fortunate to be one of the beneficiaries of Sara Lee Corporation's Millennial Gift Program. Works from the company's collection traveled the world and then were dispersed to museums in cities large and small, including the collection of modern religious art of the Vatican museums in Rome. Our museum received Eugène Boudin's stunning Entrance to the Port of Dunkirk of 1889. With the purchase of the sculptures Stevedore by Richmond Barthé, and Mother and Child by Elizabeth Catlett from the Stella Jones Gallery in New Orleans in 1999, the Collections Committee began a focus on collecting works by African American artists. In 1999, plans began for a complete reevaluation and reinstallation of the Native American basket collection. Museum staff conducted correspondence with many tribal representatives. A National Endowment for the Humanities consultation grant allowed a team of staff and trustees to visit 9 museums in Phoenix, Denver, and the Pacific Northwest to do research and conduct consultations as to how to proceed with the installation. As a result, the old exhibition cases were removed and replaced by glass cases and display drawers, and photo murals and didactic panels added supplementary educational material. The connoisseurship of Catherine Marshall Gardner and the talent of hundreds of basket weavers continue to be shown in this spectacular installation. After Michael DeMarche left to take the directorship of another institution, in 2001, the museum hired its first and only full-time curator, Jill R. Chansey. This art historian was to oversee many excellent acquisitions, including European works such as an historical scene by French artist Alexandre Évariste Fragonard, 19th century American paintings such as the William Merritt Chase landscape that we saw earlier in the presentation, and flathead war shirt by Native American artist Jean Quick-to-See Smith. Collecting the work of African American artists has continued to be a priority since the turn of the century. The museum owns 2 works by Sam Gilliam and 1 by Mo Brooker, who both recently passed away. In the early 2010s, plans began for the largest expansion to the museum since the era of its founding and construction from 1923 to 25. The new spaces and renovations unveiled in 2013 yielded the best in current museum practices. The skylights in the gallery ceilings were covered, and new lighting gives the appearance of natural light while blocking out UV rays and reducing the museum's energy consumption. Collection storage space was tripled with 2,000 additional square feet. A new wing that includes the Sanderson and Christian galleries provides 3,400 square feet of space for permanent collection installations and temporary exhibitions. During opening ceremonies in 2013 for the museum's 90th anniversary, a major acquisition was unveiled, the adventuring green chandelier with copper leaf by the pioneering studio glass artist Dale Chihuly. By being installed over the black marble stairwell designed by Michael Foyle, the 8-foot chandelier pays tribute to the 1983 renovations. Chansey ended her 10 years at the museum in 2011, so during the transformative years of the building work, Tommy Rogers served as both registrar and curator. In early 2015, I was hired as curator of collections and exhibitions, and I was asked to find large contemporary canvases to adorn the walls of the new Sanderson Gallery. We were aided by the museum's first true acquisitions endowment fund, established in 2014. The first purchase with the Moran R. Burbett Acquisition Endowment was John Alexander's evocative souvenir of Hurricane Katrina, Eye of the Storm. Although the collecting focus of the museum over the last 30 years has been to strengthen our American art collection, acquisitions in other areas have continued through donation, and some purchases have been made to fill in voids in the collection. Our catalog, The Floating World, ukiyo-e prints from the Wallace B. Rogers collection, was funded by Evelyn and Michael Jeffcoat, and in their honor, the museum acquired this impressive print by Utagawa Kuniyoshi in 2008. In 2018, the museum was approached by Bruce and Fran Walker about a donation of silver pieces from their family collection. This resulted in the acquisition of 47 works of Georgian silver, which include forms such as a brandy warmer and makers such as John Eames and Scott Digby, not yet a part of the collection. This delicate etching was donated in 2019, which was 92 years after another work by Jean-Francois Millet, The Pastel First Steps, was given from Lauren Chase Eastman. This delicate etching was donated in 2019, which was 92 years after another work by Jean-Francois Millet, The Pastel First Steps, was given from Lauren Chase Eastman's collection. Since its inception in 2014, the Moran R. Burbett Acquisitions Fund has allowed the purchase of major works of art, including this monumental watercolor by Andrew Wyeth, Spruce Timber. The museum has continued to collect Native American baskets over the last decade, and in 2014, 5 examples were acquired to fill in gaps in the collection, including these 2 examples. This work by Preston Singletary, purchased in 2020, complements both the basket collection and our beloved Chihuly chandelier. Salmon yellow Clinket basket unites European glassblowing techniques with themes and forms from Singletary Northwest native heritage. With the 100th anniversary in mind, the museum had been searching for a major work, and several artists who had long been on our radar were considered. New Orleans sculptor Lynn Emery had been the subject of an exhibition at the museum back in 1977, and at the time there was talk of acquiring a work, but this didn't happen. Emery passed away in 2021, and the next year the museum purchased a masterwork from her estate, Umbrella Tree. Our 100th anniversary publication, A Century of Collecting American and European Paintings, Prints, and Sculpture at the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art, is the latest in a long line of publications that have celebrated our collections. An updated Handbook of the Collection, first written in 1989, was published in 2003. Curator Jill Chansey oversaw its updating and reprinting. Donald Wood of the Birmingham Museum of Art wrote new entries for Japanese prints. Chansey, Registrar Tommy Rogers, and Curator of Education Mark Brown wrote entries for the American and European editions. By Native Hands, Woven Treasures from the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art is a 300-page catalog of the Native American basket collection. It was produced in 2005 with the research and writing help of scholars Kenneth Carlton, Betty Duggan, William Ashley Harris, Joyce Harold, Don Klinsman, and Stephen Cook. This publication accompanied an exhibit of 65 baskets that traveled to 10 venues from 2005 to 2007. The museum's Japanese print collection was celebrated in 2008 on the occasion of the museum's 85th anniversary with the publication of The Floating World, Ukiyo-e Prints from the Wallace B. Rogers collection, which I mentioned earlier. It had an introductory essay by Dr. Hans Thompson of the University of Zurich and was funded by the Jeffcoats. From 2011 to 2014, 50 prints were sent out to 7 museums in a related traveling exhibition. In 1978, the Mississippi Arts Commission helped to fund an initial catalog of the George and Silver collection. This had been researched by several docents, including Vonsil Coram, Shirley Leggett, and Rose Helen Walters, who you see here in a newspaper article of the time. In celebration of our 95th anniversary in 2018, we published The Currency of Taste, the Gibbons George and Silver collection of the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art. This full-color catalog was funded by Jean Gilchrist in honor of her husband, Stuart Gilchrist, a passionate silver collector, and Jeanette Walker, who was at the time the collections committee chair. A Century of Collecting American and European Paintings, Prints, and Sculpture at the Lauren Rogers Museum of Art is the latest in this impressive list of books. It is made possible by our major Centennial Fund contributors, whose names are listed at the front of the beautiful publication. Many trustees and donors have significantly added to the care and growth of the collection throughout the history of the museum. Their generosity has allowed the institution to continuously build on existing strengths and has enhanced the institution's ability to serve as a cultural touchstone for our community.